But here's an interesting thought from Kyle Kulinski. This tweet sort of went viral, started a big discussion online, including on Twitter. And, it's in response to this notion that identity politics and wokeness cost the Democrats the election. But as Kyle points out here, Kamala did not mention race, gender, trans people, pronouns, Latinx, cancel culture, or political correctness. These are a lot of the big, identity politics sort of issues that are commonly associated with the left, commonly associated with Democrats. And despite the fact that Kyle's right, she didn't mention this stuff, the Republicans actually did. They constantly talked about this stuff. They talked about it in their ads. They ran attack ads on Kamala Harris relentlessly, saying that she paid for the sex change operations of immigrants, stuff like that, right? Prisoners, yeah. You might have heard some of those talking points from Anna Kasparian as well over on TYT. But anyway, Kyle goes on to mention that Kamala Harris did talk about patriotism, freedom, owning a gun, representing all Americans, and cracking down on the border. Anyone who tells you that she was too woke is just effing lying to you and caving in to bullshit far-right framing. I have a lot of thoughts about this. Actually. But do you want to give your thoughts first, Zach?
Yeah, let's unpack this, because you're right. There's going to have to be a lot of, let's set the table for this, right? So politics in America doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Everybody who runs for higher office typically has come, with the exception of Donald Trump and the newer phenomenon of just being a rich person who decides to throw their hat in the ring. Typically, you've run other races, you've built up a long career, you've built up a pedigree, right? You're going to have made alliances with your party. And typically, the individuals that the party elevates to the top are going to be individuals who represent, what the party line is, right? They represent what the Democratic Party thinks of itself, right? So what former DNC chair Jamie Harrison thought of the Democratic Party, right? What the people on MSNBC think of the Democratic Party. Those are the people who are going to be elevated in American politics. And that's why we got a guy like Joe Biden at the end of, or at the beginning end of the pandemic, right? 2020. Okay. Why did we get him instead of Bernie Sanders? Because that's who the party elites wanted. They all rallied around him. They said, we're going to go with this old guy because we think he's the guy that has the best chance of not beating Donald Trump, but staying true to our values and potentially beating Donald Trump, right? And then they said, oof, that kind of flies in the face of our branding, right? That kind of flies in the face of everything that we've been talking about being the young, hip party and not the old white guy party, right? So that leads to Kamala. And you made that point earlier when we were on the phone, Gavin, about how Kamala Harris kind of got the job over Amy Klobuchar because there was a lot of pressure on the Democrats to pick a black woman to be the VP, and it was a total superfluous virtue signal, right? There was no relationship between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, and we saw that evidence throughout the entire 4 years he was in office. They were totally out of sync. They were not friendly towards each other, right? And she eventually ousted him and then lost, right? Pretty much sealing the deal that they'll never be friendly again. So I think with all of that baggage in the background, it's true that when she finally got the chance to run the race, she smartened up and she talked about patriotism, freedom, owning a gun, representing all Americans, right? But I think it's fair to say that the cake was already baked with people's perception of Kamala Harris and the fact that they felt like she'd been rejected by the Democratic Party during the primary, and they felt like Joe Biden never really elevated her and she never seemed like a strong part of the administration for her to be thrust out there. Even they just didn't care what she said. They'd already kind of made up their mind about how she'd gotten where she was and how she was going to govern. So they just projected all of the right-wing talking points back onto her because that's what they assumed about the Democrats.
Yep, 100%. I think that's very well said. And I think it's accurate to point out that, yeah, Kamala Harris was an affirmative action pick. There's no way around it, guys. She absolutely was. Now, that doesn't mean she wasn't qualified for the job. She was a senator. She was AG, vice president. Yeah, clearly those are qualifications, a lot more than Donald Trump ever had, right? But that also doesn't take away from the fact that every American could obviously see that, yeah, she was only picked for reasons that basically amount to affirmative action. Joe Biden originally was talking about picking a guy like Beto O'Rourke as his vice president. You know what I'm saying? Clearly, he didn't want to have to pick Kamala Harris. And frankly, he should not have picked Kamala Harris. He could have still gone the affirmative action route and picked someone who was way better than Kamala Harris. Picked a black woman, yeah, who was way better of a politician than Kamala Harris. And then guess what? It would have mostly neutralized that whole talking point. Because if you had someone in there that was actually good, someone like, I don't know, maybe Karen Bass or Barbara Lee potentially.
Karen Bass probably would have been right up the alley too.
I think she was on the short list.
Yeah,
I think they both were on the short list. And of course, Joe Biden picked the worst of them, Kamala Harris, who comes off like a manager, comes off like a middle school vice principal, something like that. But again, no one would have cared about the affirmative action angle if Kamala Harris had actually been a really talented, high quality vice president. No one really would have cared. If she did a great job in that role, people would have quickly forgotten about that. But she did not do a good job in that role. She spent 4 years flailing and flopping. And part of that is because Joe Biden never set her up to succeed. They set her up to fail, and fail she did. She never was able to override the context in which she was selected. And she basically just remained in the background for 4 years until all of a sudden she was thrust on everyone. Now it's her turn. So that is true. I think that is definitely worth acknowledging. But I also do think it's fair to acknowledge that, Kyle is correct. Kamala did about as good of a job as she could have trying to deal with this issue of identity politics and how it's kind of putrefied the brand of the Democratic Party to a certain segment of the population. I think Kamala did about as good of a job as she could have for the reasons that Kyle mentioned. She did not constantly talk about being the first female president. She did not talk about, breaking the glass ceiling. She did not condescend black male voters and pressure them to vote for her in the same way that Obama did, right? She actually was pretty decent at walking this line, pretty deft, all things considered. I think she actually had some really good answers when asked about stuff like this. People said, why do black men need to vote for you? And she said, they don't. It's their vote. I need to win it from them. I need to appeal to them and win their trust. That was a great answer. Kamala Harris did a really good job. And, well, again, I do think it's fair to say that she did a terrible job as VP and that the affirmative action angle always kind of prevented her from taking off in a serious way. I also think it's fair to acknowledge that a lot of Americans are pretty racist and pretty sexist, and that they did just project all of this identity politics and woke stuff onto a candidate because she was a woman of color. If Kamala Harris was a white man, a straight white man, no, people would not be blaming identity politics for the Democrats' loss. They would not be blaming all these marginalized groups. They would not be blaming culture war issues nearly as much as they are, because of the fact that it's Kamala Harris, even though, again, she probably ran a less woke campaign than Bernie Sanders. I'm not even kidding you guys. Bernie Sanders talked more about trans people. He talked more about LGBT issues. He talked more about racism and sexism and, all this SJW stuff, even though it's accurate. You know what I'm saying? It still comes off like that. She talked about it less than Bernie Sanders did. But Bernie Sanders obviously is considered the less woke candidate than Kamala Harris because he's an old white man. Same with Joe Biden, right? So yeah, it is fair to point out that a lot of Americans are really fucking racist and they're really fucking sexist, and they didn't listen to a goddamn thing Kamala Harris was talking about. They just projected all of this identity politics BS onto her because she is a black woman.
Yeah, I think that both of those things can be true, right? The fact that she probably, it was going to be very, very, very hard for her no matter what she did to win. And I think that she said some things that were correct and some things that weren't correct, right? Like, I didn't really agree with her framing the way that she tried to be a Republican when it came to the border, right? I thought that her cracking down on the border, I think while those might be supposedly red meat to Republicans, historically, Democrats need to present an alternative vision and not just a diet vision of the Republican Party. But here's what we have to also reckon with, everyone. And Gavin, you and I have talked about this off air. I'm not sure how much we've gotten to it on air, but this is what the polling was looking like for Joe Biden when Kamala Harris dropped out. And I think we have to understand that this is what she inherited, guys. When I saw this map a few weeks ago, when it first leaked from the Pod Save America guys, they didn't bother to show this to anybody until after the election, even though they were also sitting on it for the last multiple weeks of the Kamala Harris campaign. This is where she was fighting back from, everyone. 135 electoral college votes. She had Omaha, Nebraska, Rhode Island. Okay, what's this, like Massachusetts, New York, California, Oregon, Washington, and I don't know, Maryland. Is that what's that over there? I have no idea. I don't even know. Delaware, maybe. Yeah, I think it's Delaware. Anyway, it was an absolute ass whooping. It was the clobbering of the century. That's what she was inheriting, guys. And she fought back. She clawed back. And she did it because she was running, I think, she ran a campaign that was 100% catered to the people that resented her because of her blackness and because she was a woman, and the people who were inherently skeptical because of those things, right? She served up on a silver platter everything to the Republican Party, right? And she was able to win over the people who absolutely hated Donald Trump because they thought that he represented a threat to democracy, which was her strategy. The problem is that's not enough people to win an election, and that's why the Democrats have to change. She made up about as much ground as I think she possibly could have, given the strategy that she employed, right? So it would be totally crazy to say that she ran a woke campaign. She did not. It would be totally crazy to say that if she hadn't submitted to the radical left, she would have won. Because if she had submitted to the radical left, she would have changed a policy on something. And I waited a long time to make up my mind about this because I was really disheartened about this issue, Gavin. We went to Chicago. We were prepared. We wanted to be a part of the mass movement to stop the horrors in Palestine, right? To stop the suffering that the United States' military and weapons manufacturers are profiting off of and deeply, deeply involved in, right? And that's the ethnic cleansing that's happening to the people of Gaza. And when people really did not show up for that, I just kind of assumed, wow, Americans do not care about foreign policy at all. And I think one of the things that I learned that was actually wrong about that was they just don't believe either party will change it. And that was kind of one of the evaluations that I had to come to terms with. It was like, no, dude, they didn't show up because they were like, it doesn't matter, right? And I think what Kamala Harris could have done if she wanted to run a woke campaign in the truest sense of the term, what she would have run on diverging with Joe Biden when it comes to foreign policy. She would have run on an arms embargo. And I think that's the only possible way that she could have gotten across the finish line. If you look at the numbers, I think that's the only way that you make back the youth vote. And I think that's the only way you make back the Muslim American vote in a way that makes it close. And I don't think it's actually possible for her to have ever gotten to 300 electoral college votes, knowing what I know now. Obviously, hindsight's 2020. At the time, I thought she really could just, get across the finish line on the anti-fascist messaging. That's a fantasy.
Yeah, honestly, I don't know if that would have secured the race for her. It definitely would have made it closer. I agree. That was a terrible strategy. But yeah, that would have made it closer, certainly. Here's also an interesting response on Reddit. This post from Kyle Kulinski kind of went viral, got posted on a couple different subreddits. Here's someone saying Trump voters were listening to Trump propaganda, not carefully critiquing Kamala as an option to vote for. This is all about propaganda, not being a good candidate. We are fighting the wrong war. And a lot of people, again, specifically lefties, specifically people that are very serious, they don't like to admit this, but a lot of times it's true, guys. It almost doesn't even matter what Kamala Harris did or said, because as Kyle pointed out, she didn't run on identity. She didn't run a woke campaign. She ran a less woke campaign than freaking like John Fetterman did in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman freaking flew the trans flag outside of the Pennsylvania governor's mansion for days and days and weeks. And that didn't cost him the election in Pennsylvania, again, because he's a white guy. He doesn't code as woke. Kamala does. But either way, I think this is accurate. I think for a lot of people, again, it doesn't even matter what Kamala Harris does or says, because their perception is not being shaped by what she does or says. It's being shaped by propaganda, right-wing propaganda. They're not listening to entire Kamala Harris speeches. They're not watching rallies like we do and taking in the totality of her presentation. No, they're just watching Fox News and seeing ads from Republican propaganda outlets, which paint her in a very selective way. And obviously both sides are guilty of this, right? The left will do the same to Republicans where they can. But I think it's true that in a sense, we're almost talking about the wrong thing. We're almost fighting the wrong war in the sense that Kamala could do anything. Any candidate could do anything. And it ultimately wouldn't matter because the propaganda is what changes people's minds. And a lot of people aren't even actually plugged into reality. They're only plugged in to the propaganda. And in many cases, they don't realize it because they think that propaganda is news, right? That's the problem with the incredibly capitalistic media environment that just tells people what they want to hear instead of actually the facts of the matter. So that's a scary thing, right? It's like how do you even fight that, right? Oh, well, we just need better propaganda. Well, those people are already too far gone. They're already in their propaganda echo chamber. They're already in their bubble. How do you get them out of that? By creating twice as effective propaganda? It's like no one wants to be in a propaganda arms race. You want to be talking about policy. You want to be talking about uplifting people's lives. You don't want to be talking about, oh, who can produce the better propaganda? That's not a healthy democracy.
Yeah, I think you're onto something, and it's kind of unnerving, right? It's kind of frightening, and I think it's an L for people, we started our show during the pandemic, right? And it was the time that everybody said it was the absolute worst time to start a podcast because everybody was starting a podcast and they were like, oh, nobody's going to listen to you. And we were like, fuck you. We're listening to ourselves if nobody listens to us, And so we just kept going, right? But I think it was a serious time for the left to make up ground in the propaganda battle because everyone was at home. And I don't think people fully appreciated it. I certainly did it, right? I'm not coming at this on a high horse. I'm coming at this with an investigative lens in hindsight. It was an opportunity for us to make up tremendous ground where the right had absolutely dominated online independent media. They had just wiped the floor with the left. You had a few people standing out, like Michael Brooks was writing against the web, right? You had a few people who were out here, Kyle Kulinski, but it wasn't the norm, right? And then during the pandemic, a lot of these shows exploded in popularity. Post Bernie, a lot of new shows exploded in popularity. So many people were at home watching. What else did you have to do? Nothing. So and there was a real blurring of the lines in production value between what a really high quality show that was made by a mega corporation would look like and what a show that Gavin and I could put together would look like, or somebody who had like a little bit more means than me and Gavin. Like look at Mike Figueredo's show at the Humanist Report, right? One guy in Oregon making this show. Production value was about the same as what ESPN was putting out for a lot of their biggest stars, right? So it blurred the lines and we were able to, for a moment, make up a lot of ground. And that's not just the left, progressive left. That's like MSNBC. That's like the Pod Save America bros. That's all of these different outlets. They were exploding in popularity and we were getting representation to people, right? People were seeing our ideas and hearing our ideas. And I think that had a serious impact on getting Joe Biden across the finish line, right? I think it also had to do with a lot of other things, right? But I do think we were competing in 2020 a lot better in the media sphere than it felt like we were competing in 2024. Do you agree with that?
I do. Yeah, I do. And I think part of the reason why we were doing better at that point is because the space wasn't completely taken over by people like Destiny who just want to act like the left is to blame for everything. And secretly the Republicans are actually right about things. That's kind of the new dominant ideology when it comes to a lot of pro-democratic pro-democratic media or propaganda, whatever you want to call it. It is sort of neoliberal in flavor now, increasingly establishment friendly. Here's what Tim Pool had to add.
Yeah.
I hope liberals listen to Kyle. This is sage advice. Democrats are not too woke. That's a lie. They should keep doing their thing. And again, I kind of am like between two different opinions here. On one hand, I think that Kyle is totally correct. He's right about the fact that Kamala did about as good as she could have. But I also think that you're right, Zach. The cake was already sort of baked for Kamala. People already had a perception of her that was partially fair and partially was unfair. But either way, it was their perception. So I think Kamala, there wasn't really ultimately much she could do. And here's my main takeaway when it comes to wokeness and identity politics and how much it affects any given candidate. I actually just think it's on a candidate by candidate basis. People try to paint with this really broad brush and be like, people don't like this. People don't like that. Well, guess what? People quote unquote didn't like a lot of the things that Donald Trump was proposing before he came on the scene. A lot of the things that he ran on would have polled as unpopular. Because why? Because they weren't normalized yet. Obviously, Trump came in like a bull in the china shop and normalized a bunch of stuff and made it popular. People weren't talking about tariffs. People weren't talking about building a freaking border wall. A lot of the stuff he normalized. He made people think these are the answers. He made people think these are the solutions, right? But they didn't think that before he told them to. In the same way, I think good candidate, a good politician, a good Democrat actually could run a quote unquote woke campaign. Like I said, back in the day when John Fetterman actually used to be based before he totally sold out, he was unapologetically pro-LGBT, pro-trans. He flew the trans flag outside of the lieutenant governor's office in the the Pennsylvania legislature, whatever, right? He was loud and proud, super pro-LGBT, and it never hurt him. People appreciated it. They felt like it was him being bold and honest and sticking up for marginalized people. And he didn't do it in a moralizing way. He did it in a I'm going to stick up for my neighbors. I'm going to stick up for the downtrodden. I'm going to stick up for the marginalized because that's what good people do. And that's how you have to sell it. A lot of people don't know how to sell it. So it does come off as moralistic and it does come off like virtue signaling. People hate that shit. And that's what bad politicians do. That's how bad politicians try to sell identity issues. That's how bad politicians stick up for marginalized people. They do it in a way that actually hurts marginalized communities. Good politicians can just stand up for people and make it sound like common sense, make it sound like the right thing to do, and make it popular. Like I said, look at the way John Fetterman used to behave before his stroke, before he completely sold out to the right wing. Lots of politicians have done it. Even Jesse Ventura, who's a more macho guy than Jesse Ventura? Who's a more manly man than Jesse Ventura? What was his reason for endorsing Kamala Harris? He was like, I want a woman president.
I've only got a few elections to go. I'm 73 years old now, so the window's closing. I want to be alive to see the first woman president of the United States of America and the first woman commander-in-chief.
But no one's going to call Jesse Ventura woke because he comes off like a normal person. He doesn't come off like he's virtue signaling. He comes off like he's being honest.